Hey, everybody. Tony here. And as you all know, zero music intro, zero sponsors. I'm not sponsored by Cialis or any other, because I'm older now. And that was a joke, guys. Okay. So I've got Andrew Huberman on here, and I've been trying to get you on my podcast for months. And I've heard you on tons of other podcasts, and I've been insanely jealous. And you finally made time to get on the call. So Andrew, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Tony. Really, really happy to be chatting with you today.
So most of my listeners are law enforcement, military, firefighter, martial artists, CrossFitters, people who deal with stress, anxiety, fear, concern for aerobic capacity and changing their state and everything. And I first learned about you from my good friend, Brian McKenzie, following him. And then I started, stalking your site. And then I was like, holy shit, this is really some interesting things. And what I'm hoping will evolve, and I wanted to get you on here because, like, I'll say to people, I just need to know how to use my app to reduce my stress, but I don't need to build like an Apple Watch or an iPhone. I don't need to understand that. I don't need to be the guy that understands the technology. At the same time, there's a bit of while I'm saying that, I realize there's a partial contradiction, because I tell people, like, when you truly understand proprioception, kinesthetic perception, the efficiency of the system, you see it differently. And that could impact either neuroplasticity or how you actually think about what you have to do. So you've been doing, this is a preamble to turn the mic over to you. You've been doing some really nice user-friendly videos on Instagram where you're trying to, like, help the layperson to understand things that a lot of people keep very pedantic. So it's like the professor making you feel stupid because you don't understand the word he's saying and all that. So I love that about your feed. But one of the things that I want to talk about, of course, is fear, of courage, is mindset, is all of that stuff. But why don't you, like, let our listeners know a little bit of your background and how you came to all this? Because your story is pretty interesting. I've listened to one podcast with your parents and their education and how you got into this. And we talked months ago. You used to box and run around in the street. So it's counterintuitive that you are where you are doing what you do a little bit.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the introduction. And so where to start? I want to, first of all, I want to promise your listeners that we will get to three topics that you mentioned that I think are extremely important to understand mechanistically, for everybody to understand mechanistically, important to understand practically, and then to really appreciate just how plastic, meaning malleable or changeable, the circuits are for them. And those are the circuits for what we call fear, or the anxiety and stress response. It can mean many things, but courage, putting some real clear definition on what we mean by that and how it works, and so you can make it work better, or engage it in the first place. And then the last one, you mentioned growth mindset. My colleague and friend Carol Dweck at Stanford, cultivated this thing, discovered this thing called growth mindset, and it's a beautiful concept and practice, but it's something that is unfortunately been misunderstood by the masses, and it deserves, I think, clearer attention to what it really means. Oh, there you are. Sorry. So in any event, I'll make sure that we get to those, because growth mindset is really the key to everything, including neuroplasticity. And most people, I'll just press it just a little bit. People think growth mindset means, just wanting to be better. And I guess it could mean that, and that's a great thing to have in place. But growth mindset is actually something very specific, geared around generating positive reward from what I call friction. It's really about being on the incline or on the growth curve. And Carol and I are actually starting to talk about the neural circuits behind growth mindset, how to engage them. And so I'll be sure to get around to that later, because I think your listeners in particular will find that useful, or I certainly hope they do. Okay, so briefly, I always say it's a danger to ask a professor to speak about their work, right? So I'll start with a joke. There are two things you never say to a professor. One is take your time, and the other is what do you work on? And you definitely don't want to say those in the same sentence because you're in for a long, torturous ride. So I'm going to avoid that and just start off by saying I'm not a physician. I'm a Ph.D. in neuroscience. So I'm not a physician. I don't prescribe anything, but I'm a professor, and I profess lots of things, meaning I'm deeply interested in the human species, but from the standpoint of the ways in which we can make ourselves better. So I think the most fundamentally interesting thing about human beings is that they can direct their own changes. And most of those changes can occur through the nervous system, through the brain and body. Now, of course, you can direct physical changes too, but we're the only species on the planet that, wakes up and makes New Year's resolutions or sets goals and works on those goals in those kinds of deliberate ways. Mm. And that is truly unique. And I think it's the reason why we and not any other species are the curators of the planet. So,
nice.
So it's your God-given, nature-given, whatever your leanings are, right. And it's a incredibly important power that everyone has to some extent. So I think then understanding how to engage what I call this self-directed plasticity or self-directed changes, how to really obtain those changes is fundamentally one of the most interesting questions in the world, in our existence, in the history of human beings. Okay, so a little bit about my background. I'll go a little bit in reverse. So currently I'm a tenured professor of neurobiology at Stanford School of Medicine. I'm also have an appointment in ophthalmology because I have a longstanding interest and focus on vision science. My lab works on two main things. One is neural regeneration after injury, because the brain and spinal cord neurons don't regenerate after injury. So we have clinical trials going for glaucoma. In my lab, we're interested in molecular programs that could allow nerve cells to regenerate. Important problems for getting people out of wheelchairs and seeing again if they're going blind or are blind. The other half of my lab focuses on the questions about fear and courage. And what brought me to those was twofold. First of all, I wanted to understand how arousal state, meaning the overall levels of autonomic arousal or stress in the body, impact our perceptions and our behaviors and what we're capable of. Because what I saw as an adult and still see is that there's a lot of mixed messages. We're told you have to dig in and drive really hard and push and reach. And then we're also told that rest and relaxation are key. We're told as kids, and kids nowadays are told, look, you got to push yourself, you got to drive yourself. But, if you're struggling, maybe that's not your leaning, it's not your calling, it's not your destiny. So there's all this mixed messaging. And so, at some level, the question becomes a scientific one, which is how does stress change what we're capable of for better or for worse, right? Because if you're dead, your autonomic arousal is 0. If you're in a coma, it's just a little bit higher than that. And if you're sleepy or kind of bored, you're not going to get much done in life. But if you're panicking, you know as well as anyone, probably better than anyone, just how much that can impair your ability to function properly, especially when moments are critical and actions are critical and milliseconds count. So I wanted to put some meat on this thing about stress. And, that's why I believe in mechanism. That's why I believe in doing science. Now, my path to science, so I'll start at the other end, is a little bit unusual, and I'll try and keep this quick, but from birth until about 11 years old, I led a pretty, I would say blessed and pretty nice life. My dad actually is an academic. He's a theoretical physicist. He was one of the founders of chaos theory of all things. And so I grew up with a lot of discussion about ideas and science and stuff in my household. We had graduate students over for dinner and postdocs. It was the old days, and that doesn't tend to happen that much anymore. But I very much grew up in that culture, hearing about ideas. And, sports heroes in my house weren't really discussed. It was all about like the Feynmans and the Gell-Manns who won Nobel Prizes. And I just grew up with a heavy scientific influence. My dad's Argentine. He's not from this country, but he moved here on a naval scholarship, which made him also a very strong patriot, which I happen to be also. I have some friends who are in the military, and even though I never served in the military, I like the idea that some of the work that we're doing might actually benefit the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. So I, life was pretty standard. My mom, raised us, and then around 12, 13, they had a very high conflict, high impact divorce. It was a time in which families weren't split quite as often as they are now. And it was just a very chaotic time. So my dad moved away. My mom was largely absent. At that time, I fell deep into, it was puberty, right? So it was like gasoline on fire
Right.
to have that. But it put me in, I basically ventured deep into the kind of skateboarding and punk rock community. I got involved in the martial arts like Thai boxing, Muay Thai, and I was exposed to a lot of great stuff and great people. A lot of those guys went on to do incredible things with their lives and start companies and become professional fighters and skateboarders. And a lot of them crashed and burned and ended up dead in jail. And so I was just struck by the extent to which outcomes vary so much for people, kids, teenagers, adults, to stressors. I even though I had a lot of fun running the streets of San Francisco in the early 90s, I also saw a lot of violence. I saw a lot of sadness. I saw a lot of depression, lost people to suicide, murder. I saw probably too much so that by the time I was, 14, 15, felt like I'd been exposed to a lot and I felt like my eyes had been opened. But my life was a little bit in a tailspin. I didn't really have a direction. I wasn't aggressive or violent myself, but if there was a fight, I was game to get in. And I accrued a lot of street fights. I've been in a lot of street fights, and won some, lost some. Luckily, I'm still walking, standing. But there were some scary moments there, and I guess at that age, and maybe even still as an adult, I felt a little thirst for adrenaline. Although these days I find it in healthy ways, non-destructive ways. So I was exposed to a lot of that, and just struck by how some people handle stress really well and how some people collapse. Let's just take a typical example. Something breaks out on the street. Where I live, you see this from time to time, even still now. Something breaks out and you just notice some people pivot toward it. Some people freeze, some people run, some people run in. Very rarely do people run in unless they're trained to, or they're looking for trouble. So the response to that inflection, that increase in stress in the body, is so divergent, and I was struck by that. Anyway, years went on, and it was actually a violent incident that turned my life in what I would say a right direction. Not that I would suggest anyone go seek that. So I was Thai boxing and hoping to get some ring fights back then. This was 1994, and actually it was a 4th of July barbecue where I was living in Santa Barbara at the time. There was a fight that turned into a big melee, and a lot of my friends, in quotes, suddenly scattered, and I found myself in an altercation with 4 guys. Luckily, I had enough kind of skill and wisdom to stay engaged where I needed to and avoid getting cut, and no guns came out, but avoid getting cut. There were knives. It ended well for me. I didn't cut anyone. I managed to drop a couple guys. Police showed up, and fortunately they were the aggressors, and they had been robbing the place actually. And so I was able to, there were no legal repercussions, but I walked home that evening and I realized, I was 19 years old. I was living in this like hollowed out beach house. I was delivering bagels. I had a pet ferret. I didn't, I found out. Yeah, it was like kind of bleak. It was just it all kind of hit me at once. It's very clear. I'm going nowhere fast. My girlfriend had moved home, and I just, I didn't do well my first year in school. So I was kind of, not going to school. I barely finished high school. Thought about being a firefighter, but I hadn't really followed through with that. So I realized in that afternoon when I went back, I thought, no one's going to care about the story, right? No one's going to care my parents were divorced. No one's going to care that the house was empty. No one was going to care that my friends were derelicts, and it just didn't matter unless I did well. And even then they might not care. And frankly, I just needed to grow up. And so what I decided to do at that point was I decided to get my act together. And so I decided, the hell with finding what you love, start working and you'll fall in love with something. And so I got really excited. I went to the community college, moved myself home, went to the community college, got into biology and psychology. The field of neuroscience was very nascent then. It really wasn't formed. And eventually worked my way back into university just by, sweat and grit and hard work, and found a mentor, a professor who taught me how to do laboratory work. I went from like a straight C&D student to a straight A student, never looked back, and getting A's and performing well in my classes became the hunt, and it was tough. I like I said, I barely finished high school, and it was calculus, trig, linear algebra, biology, molecular biology, neuroanatomy. I mean, I really struggled. And so my life became, I lived alone. I lifted weights. I ran. I boxed a little bit still. Always stayed involved in the martial arts, and I studied. And I would memorize my textbooks, and I caught a lot of flack from my peers. People were like, "Oh, you study so much, come party." And I partied a little bit, and I had my fun, but I was on a path, and I eventually fell in love with this thing we call neuroscience, and continued that up through the ranks. I set my goals to get my Ph.D. by the time I was 30, get tenure, get a faculty position by the time I was 35, and get tenure at either Harvard or Stanford because they were the best by the time I was 40. And I'm proud to say I landed those goals. I achieved those goals, although I think there are other great programs and places. Those aren't the other two places. Just I had to reach for that because I really saw my life going nowhere fast. And you hear about these stories, but from people, but that was my bottom. That was rock bottom for me. And it prepared me well. I have to say, those early years of trouble and strain prepared me well because, now when I encounter people that are violent, or I encounter people that are stressed or depressed, or they're high level, high functioning academics or investors or whoever they are, I just realize that there's something common to our species, which is fundamental, which is, that I always say there are like 5 ways you can interact with life. You've got your sensations, the things you feel at a body surface level, not feelings. You've got your perceptions, like how those things look to you, what they mean. You've got your feelings or your emotions, and that's a complicated space, but we could talk about it. You've got your thoughts about all that, which is separate. Most people confuse thoughts and feelings. Those are separate. Thoughts is your God-given, nature-given right, your cognition, your ability to place order on things. And then you got your actions. And I just, and there are these guys out there, and some of whom I've been blessed enough to meet and work with. And like David Goggins is a really good example. Done a little bit of, we were both on the same consulting gig, and I like David. I love his book. And, he's like, look, no matter how you feel, engage action to get through your goal set. He's just like, he enters the picture through the action mode.
Right.
And he relegates, he sort of dismisses everything else. Doesn't matter how you feel, doesn't matter what you're sensing, doesn't matter what you're thinking. He's sort of superseded those other 4 things in order. So it's action. Now for me, I realized a long time ago that a powerful entry point is the power of thought. And I think most people, I'm just kind of, waxing poetic here, but most people I think unfortunately are trying to get in through the emotion system. They're trying to feel differently about the thing they need to do. And that's a very hard place to exist, because what we know about emotions is they tend to kind of hijack both the brain and body. And so it's very hard to defeat those. Now, David's and other people like yourself are people who are able to do that. I like to think I've been able to do that to some extent, but I think everybody should pick this. One of my wishes is that every human being will pick their favorite entry point for making themselves better. And you can lean on a variety of them, but that, some people are just better suited to thought. I realized that I might not be able to eliminate thoughts, the sort of don't imagine the elephant in the room example, and then you imagine it. But I could introduce thoughts deliberately. That's the power of the neocortex. That's the power of the human brain. That I can put in a thought if I want.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to interrupt 900 times because you're like making my brain fire stuff. But, here's the thing. In 1993, I wrote an article for the law enforcement community called The Theory of Presumed Compliance. And the premise of this whole thing is like, why do cops lose fights? Why do cops, get dropped? Why do they lose possession of their gun? And I was talking to a bunch of leaders, and I said, it's because they presume compliance. And they went, what do you mean? I go, well, the theory of presumed compliance is that if you step into the reactionary gap, you think because you're a cop, because you got a badge, because you got a flag on your sleeve, that this guy's going to cooperate. And that's changes everything in your brain, how you process information, the gap time between stimulus response. It's a whole, and one of the guys, Gary Klugowitz, who, huge advocate, and he was the chairman of the American Society of Law Enforcement Trainers at the time. He says, I've never heard about the theory of presumed compliance. Where's that from? I said, well, it's from this conversation. I just said it now. And we all laughed, and he asked me to write an article. And my lead off in the article was, this is 1993, was how you feel affects how you think. How you think affects how you feel. Both influence how you move.
Right.
And it was, so hearing you talk about thoughts and emotions and feelings and feel, it's, and then, of course, I'm a fan of Goggins and, who wouldn't be, but I think it's really profound and potent of you to say, you need to find what works for you. And this, we live in a very weird era where it's that feelings, the entitlement generation, the snowflakes, the pussification, all of that. At the end of the day, and there's a couple other things I wanted to say, because I've worked with a lot of academic, like researchers and Ph.D. and people with neuroscience background who've come into our courses. In my career, I've been teaching now for 43 years. I've had these organizations who hire like forensic specialists and other people to come in, because I'd be talking about, hey, you got to get your executive function, your cognitive brain, your whatever you want to call it, neocortex, to understand what the reptilian or the amygdala, the limbic system, and all the other interconnected components that hijack you from your if then go to. Like, that's the way we train martial arts. When he does this, I'll do that. And none of that training takes into account the emotional psychological interference of the real event, like suddenly fear and doubting courage and all of that shit that I want to get into. And so I was talking about like all this. I mean, I didn't call it neuroscience back then. I used to refer to my system back in the early 90s as behaviorally inspired, genetically wired. And I would tell people like, you can tell me what you think you'll do, but we're going to videotape it. And then I want you to observe that what you said you were going to do 10 minutes ago in this scenario didn't happen. And then let's try and figure out why that didn't happen. Right. And so here, all these years later, you talk about myelinization and the way people learn. It's crazy stuff. My fascination, this is going to come full circle to this massive compliment to you and interest in this conversation and future conversations, hopefully, is that I remember in the mid-90s, I was in the United Kingdom, and there was this very famous, this guy had more diplomas and acronyms at the end of his, like I'll show you, his actual name was Anthony Bleetman, and he was in the United Kingdom, he was the guy. And this particular organization that I've helped train their trainers for decades now, sent him there because, I don't know if you've experienced this, but if you do something too many times with somebody in the government, they question if there's a conflict of interest. Like, why do you keep using these guys? And so they sent this guy in to vet me. And I walked up to him and I said, and he was like 5'6", like a professor with a long beard, like right out of a movie, right? I said to him, my interest in you being here is for you to help me pronounce big words more effectively, because nothing you say is going to change my program, because it works for the operator, it works for the end user. So if you said to me, your hypothesis about fear and arousal and how you stress inoculate, blah, 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 is incorrect, I go, well, but the drill works, right? So your theory might be theoretically sound, but practically speaking. Anyways, I was a little bit of a dick when I said it because I was defensive. I was much younger. And I said to him, I don't really care what you write about the program, because I was told he's auditing the class. So I was a little defensive. And I said, I just really, what I'm interested in, if I say amygdala, if I pronounce it incorrectly, I want you to pull me aside and say that's not how it's pronounced. That's my interest in you, is like, am I using the right words? And he kind of looks at me, and I said, but I will really respect anything you have to say is if you actually do the fucking class. He goes, what? I said, do the class as if you're one of the guys in the class. He said, is that okay with you? I said, yeah. And he did it. And we're still friends to this day. He wrote this 90-page report for the government, but he did the class. So all of this to say, I've heard you on a couple other podcasts. So why I wanted your background is because you're not just a professor. you're a martial artist. You've been in street fights. You've experienced violence. And so this, and I'm gonna be, if my 17-year-old daughter was here, I go, hey, your dad's woke, honey. And then she gets embarrassed when I say shit like that. I go, because your street cred changes everything. Most people, and everyone listening to this, all the cops, all the military guys, all the martial artists, most people who talk about fear and courage look like this professor when I first met him, where you're going, like, this guy, like, he doesn't step on ants. He saves bugs that are injured. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you could tell that he'd never been close to anything violent. And so when I'm talking to somebody about fear or stress or anxiety, if they've never, and the ring's one thing, but the gamut there. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that in that way. I'm assuming you have, because you're a deep thinker. But when I hear you talk about fear or stress, I lean a little bit more carefully, because, like, there's people that'll say to me, you're full of shit, Blauer. You've never been in the octagon, right? Like, their idea of what's valid is like, what's your record? Did you do a sport fight? And so I think it's very important, certainly for my audience, for me to recognize that and let you know that your childhood and your background and that rock bottom story, and then all of that is fascinating, but it's also incredibly important when you're talking to somebody. And as hopefully what we will get into is the application of this knowledge for personal safety. Because my whole thing, and you've heard me say this before, is that the ability to protect yourself or a loved one is arguably the single most important skill you could have. Everything goes away. Like, if in a minute from now we get run over or attacked, whether it's, an active shooter or random violence, I always make the joke, like, violence doesn't care, if you're a pacifist. Violence doesn't care what martial art you study. Violence doesn't care if you're a liberal or Republican. Violence just happens. What are you going to do? But anyways, you got me all fired up, man. I just want to say your background is way more important to me than maybe you realize.
Oh, well, thanks. I appreciate that. And to your listeners, I do, when I say, I have genuine respect for people that are, that are just reaching, that are trying to be better. And I think that those years did serve me well in terms of my current understanding of the topics that we study in the lab. And then, in my mid-30s, I got back into Western boxing. I fought some fights and did that. And then at some point, I had to make what I think for me was the intelligent choice, which was to preserve my neurology and not take it. You can't box without sparring. And it's like saying, right, you want to swim, but you don't want to get wet. It's, right. So, and I'll tell you, it's tough for me. Last time I sparred was 2 years ago. And in the evenings, I do training in boxing gym, and like every once in a while, I have to deliberately leave my gear at home, or else I know I'll climb up in there. I miss it. There's a dopamine rush to it. It's not just about adrenaline. But I think that what you teach and on the survival end, right, and preserving life and safety of yourself and loved ones is so key. And it roots right into, and we won't get into these issues, I don't think, but it roots right into kind of modern views of what people are supposed to be expected to do for themselves and handle for themselves. I think that, one thing to just kind of dive into the fear, courage, I don't want to call it a dichotomy, it's really a continuum, is a couple principles I think might be helpful for your listeners as we get into fear and courage. So first of all, there's something really important about how the brain works across systems, whether or not it's hearing or vision or smell or touch, which is this notion of push and pull. And what I mean by that is, like, for instance, the reason you can see edges of cars and objects moving is because you've got cells in your eye that are paying attention to things that are getting darker, and you got cells in your eye that are paying attention to things that are getting lighter. And it's really the mathematics that occur between those two groups of cell types that lets you see shapes and edges and know which direction they're moving. It's incredible, right? But you have to remember that the nervous system, your brain and body, are made up largely of neurons that all they can do is send electrical signals. There aren't little people in there saying, oh, it's a car. It's like, it's got to make all these fancy computations. And nature has figured out that one of the best things you can do is set up these circuits that are kind of left and right, and then do the subtraction and addition, and the mathematics of it isn't important to get into, and it's not even completely understood. So I'm not trying to sound smarter by saying I'm going to get into it, which I don't do either. So, okay, so why is that important? Well, a couple years ago, we asked a very simple question. First, we asked it in mice, but we then asked it, and we are asking it in humans. So I'll relate that. So the question we asked was, okay, you've got these things, sensations, perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and actions. And we all know that your level of autonomic arousal, let's just call it stress for the time being, strongly dictates which of those are available. So if someone is just in sheer panic or dead, their behavioral choices are limited because they can't actually control their physical body. You have these beautiful charts that describe these in flow diagram form, which I was really struck by. So I consider you a neuroscientist as well.
Thank you.
By the way. So the other thing was we know that but then everything that happens in between is interesting, right? Coma isn't so interesting for the work that we do, but high levels of anxiety or heightened levels of anxiety or alert and calm, sort of that state that we'd all like to be in. I would say most of us want to be in one of two states, alert and calm or asleep, depending on time of day and what's on your plate. So those became the goal, but we know that autonomic arousal is kind of fluctuating and it's really impacting. For instance, if my level of autonomic arousal goes up, whether or not it's in I'm getting attacked or whether or not it's a grant score I don't like or something like that, my thought processes become less available to me and less fluid and less useful, right? Because I essentially become more primitive in those modes. However, if I'm alert and calm, I can start being thoughtful about my responses. But in high stress scenarios and high stress scenarios, thinking is actually a little too slow. And we know this. So you want to be in that automaticity that's basically grounded in training of the sorts of things that you do. So here's what we did. A graduate student in the lab, Lindsay Soleil, did this incredible experiment where she took mice and she exposed them to like an overhead expanding black dot, which was basically for the mouse is like the scariest thing ever because it's like a hawk or a shadow coming in to get it. There are two responses that mice and all other species, for instance, even young babies have what's called the innate looming response. When something looms in on them quickly and they don't know what it is, they either freeze or they run. They freeze or they flee. Now, it's very interesting because both those responses, the freezing response and the fleeing response, reduce detectability. The freezing response is not so that the mouse can say, okay, eat me. It's so that if a hawk is flying above or if you're walking and you see a potential shooter at a distance, the optimal strategy in most cases, if you're a civilian and you're just out and about, would be to stop and hope that they don't see you. Now, if they are oriented away from you, then you would probably want to hide. Unless it was your task or your job to do so, you probably wouldn't run straight at them, right? It's just not the healthy response, not the adaptive response. So mice showed this. Now, what she then established was that the level of stress or autonomic arousal is lowest for the freeze response, is slightly higher for the runaway response, both of which are designed to reduce detectability. Now, at some point, if she ramped up the level of autonomic arousal, of stress in the body, and she did that by adjusting a particular brain circuit that I can talk about, then the mice, somewhat surprisingly, would confront the threat. They would actually try and attack the threat. And so there was this kind of counterintuitive find. You say, wait, stress is going up, but the animal's getting more, quote unquote, courageous. It's approaching the threat as opposed to running and hiding or freezing. And that's when we realized we were thinking about the problem all wrong. Fight or flight, to me, is a total misnomer. It's really fight or freeze. Now, because of this, there are two categories of response. And this was described by a group in Hawaii, academic group that studied the responses to threat in a variety of animals. You can either reduce your detectability by freezing or hiding, or you can reduce your killability by fighting back or running. Right? Now, when you decide to run, you're very salient, you're very visible. So you're giving up detectability in order to try and not get caught. When you fight, you're giving up detectability. You're saying, I'm here, I'm going to fight you in trade-off for surviving. Now, of course, all of them are designed to get you to survive. But what we realize is that there are these two, what we call binary circuits. There's one set of circuits to reduce detectability, and there's another set of circuits that are designed to reduce sort of killability, right? The predator's ability to hurt you directly. Right. And that is very much like the theme that we see in the eye, cells that are responsible for measuring light increments and cells that are responsible for measuring light decrements. And so as a vision scientist, we stepped back from this and we said, I wonder if the underlying algorithms are the same, meaning maybe the math is the same. Maybe the brain isn't as brilliant as we think. It's not like got a system for fear and a system for vision and a system for hearing. Maybe what it does is it takes the same sets of computations, like the measurements between light and dark, to compute motion. And it does that for registering responses to threat. And so then what Lindsay went on to do was to change the level of threat. She could kind of what we call titrate the threat. You could go low threat, medium threat, or high threat. And then she could change the level of arousal in the body of the animal, because we understand the circuits in the brain areas with which to do that. And we could go low, medium, or high. So you can go low, low, medium, medium, high, high, right? For level of threat, level of stress. Or you can go low, low with high, so that your stress level is high, but the threat is low. And we could do all the iterations. And so that's essentially what we're doing now. And in part, some of that was already published in that paper. There's a Nature paper published in 2018, which showed that essentially the high stress response enables the animal to lean into what you and I would call courage. And in addition to that, and I think here was really the part where we got most excited, there's a pathway in the brain from this so-called courage circuit that is linked up with the dopamine pathway. It's actually rewarded. So if you engage in this successful confrontation of threat and you survive, it's adaptive for you, it's actually rewarded. That pathway is more strongly reinforced. It's built up. And that told us that the sorts of training that you do with first responders, the ability to lean into stress and have a successful outcome, actually builds up a higher probability that one will do that courageous act in the future. And that's when I started reaching out to some of my friends that are, formerly in the SEAL teams, are involved in special operations and people, first responders and so forth, to try and think about how training systems could interface with this kind of thing. And so for your listeners, if any of that was just a blur, or if all of it was kind of a mess, there are circuits in your brain that under low levels of stress serve to cause you to freeze or hide, and that surprisingly under higher levels of stress can lean you into courage responses. Those courage responses are reinforced, meaning they actually felt good to the mice, and we hypothesized they could actually feel good to humans. This is not to say that if you see a fight, you should go running in because it's good for you or would feel good. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that your brain is hardwired to have one of two responses to a threat. And the brain circuits for each of those responses are separate and antagonistic. They mutually exclude one another. And you'll learn early in boxing, like if you're going to throw a punch, you better throw that thing through. If you hesitate, that's when you get hurt. Or if you don't, send it all the way through. It's the same thing. This is a switch over to another mode of being. And so I'll stop there. That's the animal study. And then we could talk about the human studies that we're doing now and some of the out of lab adventures, if you will, that we took to get the stimuli for that. But hopefully that sheds some light that your brain's stress response is not a bad thing. It makes you more or less able to engage certain types of responses. And once your stress level goes beyond a certain point, hiding in the closet, like in a hide and seek game, actually becomes impossible. There's so much level of autonomic arousal that people start teeth chattering or they can't keep from vocalizing. Right. That's actually the point in which your brain is actually trying to get you to engage, to confront. And I think one of the places where people get discombobulated, where programs get confused, are when you're trying to get people who are who have inherently low level of autonomic arousal to be more aggressive. If you've ever trained kids in sports, not just martial arts, that's a tough thing to do. And the opposite is also true. To try and suppress your stress level might be a good thing, but past a certain point, action becomes the only option.
I dig it. Hey, I made so many notes here because this is, when you talked about the what separates us from all other, living organisms, our ability to think and decide. and to communicate to ourselves. And I did years before there was the term social experiment. I did a social experiment. It was mid-80s, 85, 86. I had a group of 20 women. I walked up there and I decided, my heart was pounding. I was so nervous because I had hallucinated an experiment in my mind and I wanted to test it. And I was so nervous it was going to fail. And I had these 20 paying women at a self-defense course. And I said, I'm going to come out and I'm going to pretend this is my first class and I don't know what I'm doing. And I came out and I said, hey, everybody, Tony Blauer, welcome. Thanks for coming here. How many of you know how to defend yourself? How many here are actually black belts, martial artists, and they kind of like looked around and, it was advertised as, situational awareness, self-defense, safety. And one of them said, well, no, we came here to learn how to defend ourselves. Like, we're not experienced martial artists. I said, okay, cool. Great. I'm just asking because maybe you're coming for a refresher. Maybe you're, getting more education. I just want to see who's here. And it's funny, my heart's racing right now, reliving it. And I say, okay, Boston Strangler. How many of you could take the Boston Strangler in a fight? Like, this is like 1 minute into like the opening ceremonies of this class. And I said, sorry, I just screwed up my story. I said Albert DeSalvo, because most people don't know the name Albert DeSalvo. They know the Boston Strangler. So I said, hey, Albert DeSalvo, how many of you could take him in a fight? And they kind of looked around and said, Albert DeSalvo, you don't know Albert, Boston Strangler, allegedly raped 2,000 women, got bored with that, and then murdered and raped them. He was a necrophiliac. He would, have just a psycho, right? And so how many of you could take Albert DeSalvo in a fight? And I've got like 20 women like looking at me like their jaws are slightly open. And I can see like nervousness and panic in their face, right? And this woman at the back puts her hand up. Her name's Francine. She puts her hand up halfway. And she said, is he going to rape me or murder me? Which was a very specific question, right? And I was like, well, let's say it's the end of his career. He's going to murder, then rape you. Interesting question, Francine. And she says, well, then I'd fight because I don't want to die. And like in that moment, I realized, it was an interesting thing with what you talked about. She had said, I don't want to die, but if I had to let him rape me to live, I'm going to do that. And I said, anyone else with Francine? And they all looked around, and then you could see they're horrified. 2 minutes have gone by. The story takes 3 times longer to explain it in third person. And so they're all looking at me, and I said, guess what, everybody? Francine's the only one that survived. The rest of you are all dead. You know why? Because Albert DeSalvo was a fucking coward. He was a 5'7" asocial predator, and he only raped or murdered and raped women that cooperated with him. That when he was caught, he admitted this, and some people came forward where he had grabbed them from behind. They bit his hand, and that was enough for him to panic and leave. Anybody who resisted a little bit. So the rest of you are dead. Francine, good job. And like the room is like, and you could see that I'm doing this on purpose. My heart is pounding. I'm going, oh my God, because this is the big experiment. Then I said, okay. I said, everybody calm down. I'm new at this. Let's start over. I got off on the wrong foot. And now their confidence in me is like, they're horrified. You can see in their body language, 60% of communication. They're like, how do we get our money back? How do we get out of here? But they're on the floor listening. I go, how many of you have kids? Almost all of them had kids. I said, how many of you have babysitters? Almost all of them had babysitters. I said, okay, here's your scenario. You went out, you went shopping, you come home and your front door is slightly ajar. That's a little bit weird, but as you come in, your spider sense, something starts to kick in, and you notice your babysitter's on the ground. She's duct taped, and she's gesturing that there's someone in the house. You go completely cold to focus. You put the bags down, and you start to move towards the kitchen, and you see there's this guy there. His back is to you, and he's got headphones on, and you can tell you could hear this like really heavy rock metal music going. He can't hear you. His back is to you, and then you see your kid has been stripped naked and is tied to the kitchen table. That's as far as I get, and the fucking room erupts, where women are going, how dare you put that image in my head? One woman screamed at me, I will rip his fucking heart out. Nobody touches my kids. Another woman going, anyone touches my family, they're like, and I'm calming them down. Like I'm calming them down. And I said, ma'am, what did you say? And she's hyperventilating. She's like, She says, "What is wrong with you? Why would you put that image in my head?" I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I'll fucking rip his heart out." I said, "Medically that's impossible, but I like what you're thinking. I like where your head's going." I said, "Everyone stop. 60 seconds ago, I asked you if you'd fight Albert DeSalvo, a 5'7" piece of shit fucking coward. And you sat there going, oh, and now you're ripping people's hearts out. What is it you saw yourself doing to protect your kid that you don't see yourself doing to protect yourself?" Because the movement is the same, the thinking is the same. And it was at that moment where I coined this expression, be your own bodyguard. And the connection there was tapping into indignation. And so this idea of indignation is like this emotion, and it actually might be the buffer between the fear and the courage switch as a black box, bridge to it. Because I'll ask people, the idea here was when they could feel indignation, they suddenly had access to this courage that they would go towards the danger. And if we let them think about things too long, especially if it was happening to themselves, that freeze state would kick in. So it was really fascinating. It was literally, and it wasn't tied to technique. And I've done in 30 years of interviewing victims of violence over the years, and the victim and the victor, what changed. So I've talked to like dozens of cops that were, in a death match, where I tell people, don't be an accomplice to your murder, right? You've got to be thinking differently, right? So, and the switch wasn't, he was on top of me, I'd been stabbed, I'd been shot, and then I realized he was open for a Kimura, and I could see, I could hit him with an uppercut. It was always, I didn't want to die. It was something as simple as, I know I'm going to die, but it's not going to be tonight, right? And so what I've done is intuitively reverse engineered stuff that helps people access, and it ties to what you said right in the beginning, is we can introduce thoughts and ideas that can change our state. And so, go ahead. No.
Oh, no. So, couple concepts. First of all, that your example and the citing of indignation is a very interesting one. I don't want to go too far off on this tangent, but I saw recently this series. It's sort of like that Planet Earth series of, it's basically one of these animal series. And I love animal biology because it reveals a lot of the more primitive circuits that certainly exist in us, although we have additional circuits. And this is an example of a male lion getting attacked by hyenas. I think it was in this Families series. It's very interesting. And another male lion encountering that. And what was very interesting is you can see that typically two male lions would fight in these scenarios. And the second male lion essentially makes the decision to go in and risk his own life and run off this pack of at least 20 hyenas. They're quite vicious. I know this only because I have a colleague, when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, who used to work with hyenas. And so I've had some close-ups with hyenas. Fortunately, I was on the other side of a cyclone fence. They are not big spotted kitty cats. They are vicious. Right. Lions are afraid of them for a reason. So, but what's remarkable is you could see in the second lion's response a long pause and then a decision to risk his life for the sake of his species. These animals aren't friends. They don't understand the concept of friendship. Right. It was a circuit that was literally getting activated around preserving the life of another member of his species, which is extremely risky for him. If he was really calculating, he would have said, let that guy die and he'll get more females, right? That would have been enough food, right? But that wasn't the approach because he was free to go if he wanted. Very interesting. So a couple concepts, and it may be that's the one of the switches on this fear to courage binary circuit. I'm going to think about that. Piqued my curiosity about that. So, and the fun part about being a neurobiologist with a lab is that you can do these sorts of things. Of course, you do them on mice as humanely as you can. You can't do all the experiments you'd like to be able to do in other species, but nonetheless. So a couple ideas. So one is, I'd like people to appreciate that the stress response, autonomic arousal, is neither good nor bad within a certain range. And it's a pretty broad range. Extreme panic and dead are ranges to avoid. Ends of the range to avoid. But within there, there's tremendous range, and they impact those things: sensations, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and behaviors. and they move them around. They toggle your ability to access those. Now, one thing that that I'm very excited about, because I think we're at the point probably in this podcast where we'll go into more detail about studies, but one thing I'm just fascinated by is the fact that you have basically 3 kinds of animals on the planet, but let's simplify it, make it 2. You got animals that see in panoramic vision and have no ability. They literally don't have the eye circuitry or the brain circuitry to see in fine detail. Those animals are your grazers, your placid animals, your antelopes, some of them have, maybe some of the aficionados and hunters are going to jump on me and say, no, a deer has a visual streak, and an antelope has this little J shape. Yeah, but their acuity is poor. They just don't see well. What they see the world like a big globe, a big sphere, like a planetarium.
We don't acknowledge the provocative contrarians. So let's ignore those.
Okay.
Because I always have one in my class too. Yes, but did you know? But go on. Three times.
And I love animal specialization, so I honor that. But yeah, so most animals like cows and sheep and deer, and they're the non-carnivore, non-predators and non-primates they see the world in a sphere. They don't have high acuity vision. If you want to get a sense of what their vision is like, dial out your gaze right now and look at the entire room that you're in so you can see yourself and the space that you're in, whether or not you're indoors or outdoors. If you move your hand to the very far periphery, meaning where you can just see that your hand is moving, but you can't actually count how many fingers were there if it was somewhere else's fingers,
right,
that's about how well any of those animals see, right? Because their job is to graze, gather as much grass and things as they can, and then if there's a predator, to know which direction it's coming from and whether or not to freeze or flee. Rare YouTube examples of antelope attacking predators, but it's typically mother to young, your indignation example, deer attacking hikers and things like that, and moose and things like that. So those animals are pretty placid, so placid in fact that if an animal or a hunter were to show up and kill one of them in front of all of them, 3 minutes later they'd all be eating and grazing again. Their capacity, any human being would be traumatized, right? But their capacity to stay in the stress response is exquisitely low. It's quick. It's hair trigger, and it goes up quick and it goes down quick. So, and their vision is this panoramic vision. Now, that panoramic vision is very interesting because it allows them to be very responsive. It's carried through neurons that are very large. Magno, the name is actually magno because it's big, and it therefore transmits information very fast. There are other species like you and me, or monkeys or lions, have what's called it's actually called the midget system, believe it or not. It's not for midgets. It just means it detects high acuity, very small things. That system is what you use when you read. It's what you use when you were to fix a watch, or it's when you're looking at someone directly in the eye and you're talking. That system is associated with higher levels of vigilance and arousal in just the way that it was designed. And it has, believe it or not, slower reaction times. So one thing that I want to kind of seed the conversation with is that how you use your visual system. So this is the use of perception and sensation as an entry point to control arousal.
I got to insert something here, because is one of the things that I tell people all the time. The interruptions are important for me, especially for my audience, because most of them are it's the hand-to-hand realm, the self-defense person. But I always tell people, if you improve your perception speed, you decrease your reaction time. If you improve perception speed, you decrease reaction time or make reaction time faster, right? So that gap time between stimulus and response, that's where everything happens. How fast can you make that computation? And we improve perception speed, interestingly, by and I tried to write them down as fast as I can: perception, thought, behavior, feelings. What was the other one? It was
it goes sensation is first. That's just right. The feelings on you. There's no way around sensation. Your feet are sensing the floor. You just weren't thinking about it till I said it.
Right.
That's your perception, which is where your attentional mechanisms are directing.
Right.
Which sensations. Then there's feelings / emotions, because most they're kind of the same. And then there's thoughts, which is like if right now I want to make a deliberate thought to do something, I could do that. And then there's action.
Right.
And then arousal, autonomic arousal, is riding underneath that, driving their capacity either up or down, like an amplifier.
So in the 80s, I was interviewing a sports psychologist back in Montreal, and he introduced me to the term metacognition. I'd never heard about it, and started thinking about that and the way he described it. And it was, I kind of, as a layperson, said, well, it's how we think about thinking and how we decide to think without the interference of thought, just observe stuff and do things. And I started creating these drills that, unbeknownst to me, just listening to you say this like decades later, is we would do these force on force drills where we would do different iterations where in one iteration you did nothing, you just let the attack happen. And the experience over there was to capture the auditory, visual, and tactile cues. You would actually, with this drill called emotional climatization, and what you do is you do it in slow motion, you let the attack happen, and you do through 6 stages where you narrate everything you hear, see, or feel. And my intuitive concept was, I am now creating mental blueprints in my brain, and the more data points I have, the faster I can then make decisions based on, am I going to disengage, barricade, or charge the threat? And those connections, that decision was based on intuition and instincts, so it's really black box stuff. But we would then do, so it could be a sucker punch, it could be a knife, it could be a gun, it could be, pool cue, baseball bat. We would do the attack. We would have role players replicate the violence. We would allow the attack to happen. We would narrate if we're getting hit over. We would do it as many times as we could until we could not flinch. Like if I come at you super slow, this from getting punched in the face, right? You start to stress inoculate at a certain point. Like maybe, if you haven't sparred in a while, a guy throws a punch, you close your eyes, you turn your head. But in round 2, you're not even moving. You'll eat the punch to throw the right, if you had to. So we would then do, next iteration would be a primal, deliberate primal. What does your body want to do prior to any training? Just let that happen. That was the whole startle flinch and kind of that organic airbag. How do I cover? That fetal, improvised fetal. And then iteration, the next iteration was protective. That was when I have a pre-contact cue. My emotional, psychological system's like, oh, fuck, look out. And that was usually impacted by proximity sense and distance. So this is now really like you can't do any of this shit if your eyes are closed, right? Very, very tied into that acuity and the eyesight and that algorithm. And then the next one was tactical, where now this is where action and behavior and thought, it was like I was building on the knowledge base, the stress inoculation from phase 1, 2, 3, 4, to say, danger is imminent. I need to move towards this threat. Retreat is not an option right here. And how do I do something? So it was all this cascading stuff. It's just fascinating stuff because you're providing like language and concepts that really make me even more passionate about the shit we were doing, because I was able to take I could have in my class, like, someone who'd been the victim of a sexual assault and someone else in an open seminar who's, studying police sciences and want to be a cop, and put them in the same scenario and observe almost the same behavior at an animal level. It didn't matter that one said, well, I'm going to be, a protector and move towards the danger, and someone else, that once they understood the drills in the system, the stress inoculation started to take over, that they started, and they're all tied to auditory, visual, and tactile cues that we had in deliberately pre-programmed through what I called replication training. I didn't let people, in other words, if I said, Andrew, we're going to do the drill, I want you to punch me in the face. If you got into a good boxing stance or a Thai boxing stance, I'd say, no, I want you to throw the punch like you're going to sucker punch me in a mugging. In other words, we deliberately removed any sport bias from it, and we would do the drills over and over again. Anyways, I'm off on a little tangent and rant here, but it's fascinating to me listening to this stuff, and I had to throw that in there, and I interrupted you. Do you remember where you were?
No problem. Yeah, no, you bet. I mean, so it's interesting. I think the practical implications of this are real. If you've ever been walking around or biking and then you close your eyelid and a bee hits your eyelid, that was your magnocellular system. So fast, You didn't even know that thing was coming, and you went all the way from sensation to the exact motor command you needed to protect yourself without thinking about it. It was actually all below the neocortex.
So that's happened a lot on a bike or a motorcycle, but how do you explain, and I'm not being the dick contrarian, the times that you do get the bug in the eye?
Well, I mean,
Just happenstance.
Yeah, I mean, you're not always going to be quick enough, but
right.
far quicker there than the reason you were able to do it successfully some of the time because you were in panoramic vision. You weren't focused on any one thing. Now, here's why. So if focal vision is great for high acuity things, meaning you get better resolution. It's like you're more pixels. The panoramic vision is faster but lower acuity. This is like lower quality vision. It's grainier. That was the example, your fingers moving in the periphery. So animals like lions and us and primates can switch back and forth. And a lion is pretty smart. It spends most of the day in panoramic vision because it's pretty costly to be in focal vision. We're not so smart. We spend our whole day looking at our phones and orienting to everything, burning down our attentional capacity. And that's a kind of a separate discussion. But here's the thing. This is a real thing. It's not an imagined or even an experimental thing. There's a feature of your visual system, which is when you have a heightened level of stress or arousal, same thing, your pupil, independent of how bright it is in the room, or space that you happen to be in, gets bigger. Why? So when you are in a state of stress, your pupils go wide, or if you're attracted to somebody, your pupils go wide. Same thing. It's autonomic arousal, just different things are going on, slightly different things. What happens is the pupils get bigger, and that actually changes the optics of the eye such that you're better at seeing and tracking individual things in your environment, but your focal depth, your ability to sense front and ground or depth falls away. When you're in a low level of arousal, like you're calm, you actually are sensing depth better, and your motor reaction times are much faster. So this is the reason why when you're really stressed, and I've had this experience, just doing standard Western boxing in the ring, but you can even get this sometimes if you're triggered by somebody or you're in an argument, you start getting a soda straw view of the world. And two things happen that are critical to understand. One is you literally see less. That's kind of a duh. So I already told you, you're seeing fewer things better, but you're missing the punches coming in from the periphery. You're missing if there's multiple attackers, just to kind of stay in the genre of the sorts of training that you do for people. Staying in panoramic vision is a huge asset for your reaction time and your ability to sense things coming in. In fact, if you've ever been in a scenario where you stay in this mode of kind of panoramic vision, or what yogis and stuff, I don't really borrow that language too much, soft gaze, you can actually start to see things moving not as direct trajectories, but arcing in, because you're in that kind of globe of panoramic vision, where punches start to look, even straight, start to look like they're arcing in slightly. That so-called matrix advantage of being able to slow down time, that's being in the magnocellular system. That's what that is. That ability to feel like you're moving faster than your opponent, and they're kind of slowed down and you're moving quick. That is a real sensory motor advantage.
Yeah.
Now, in focal vision, you do gain the advantage of being able to track individual things like a single threat. I mean, it exists for a reason. Nature isn't dumb. But the ability to stay calm or calm enough will allow you to stay in that sweet spot where you can see things coming in. You're literally slowing them down by virtue of the trajectories through which you view them coming, even though they're coming straight at you. And you're able to then engage motor commands to adjust. I always kind of laugh that they always teach parrying punches at the first boxing class. If you fight and you come up learning Western boxing from guys that are really serious and women that are really serious, what happens is they teach you to use your feet first, right? You're not going to sit there and parry punches or slip punches, because what the requirement for parrying and moving your head, actually, if you're quite skilled, you can do it, but it actually involves staying quite calm so that you can make those very small focal adjustments between this parvocellular and magnocellular system. This is, I believe, one of the things that Floyd Mayweather, like him or hate him, made him such an excellent fighter and other fighters so good, is their absolutely exquisite sense of depth. I mean, he was slipping punches by centimeters, right? And I know we're all audio, but I'm moving my head here. That is a super skill. that requires immense calm to make those very small judgments in depth. Now, for most people, the ability to stay in panoramic vision is the ability to stay calm. So one of the things we're working on in my lab now is we're asking the question, can the use of the visual system be used to control the stress system and not just the other way around? And it's preliminary, so I want to put an asterisk next to it, but the answer, and I think we expected this answer based on everything from the animal kingdom and so forth, is that the answer is looking like a yes. That by staying in panoramic vision, you're able to see more, react quicker, and you gain a true tactical advantage. And that's not to say you should be looking at the corners of the room. It means you should be taking in the whole picture.
Yeah, and
so hopefully that's a useful thing for your listeners. I'd love your thoughts on that.
It's fascinating to me, and I've got like a page of notes because so what I love doing is when I started doing scenario training, it was 1980. One of my students got his ass kicked in a fight. I was training him. His dad asked me if they were to train his 15-year-old son. I said, yeah, no problem. Good friend of the family's. They have the altercation back and forth. It was the first time this bully put his hands on this kid, and Mitch reacted emotionally, grabbed him, slammed him against a locker bank at school, and said, fucking leave me alone. You've been bugging me since school started. And the guy just dropped him with a left hook. So I said to Mitchell, I go, Mitch, we've been training. Why didn't you slip? Why didn't you parry? Why didn't you check it? Why didn't you bob and weave? Why didn't you? And he looks down and he looks at me, in the face, Andrew, and he goes, well, I was holding his shirt with my left hand and I had my school books in my right hand. And in that moment, it was like the God, I tell people, like a lot of people have heard this because I told the story 100 times, the God of self-defense slammed me in the head. And I said, oh my God, we teach self-defense wrong. Because what I'd been teaching him were a complex motor skill, options that you would use in sport combative contests. And yeah, there's direct application for self-defense or street and what have you, but there's so much more going on. Like imagine if you had to box somebody, but you had to hold on to his jersey and have like books in your hand. How soon till you get hit with a fucking hook punch? Like immediately, right? And so that day in 1980, I was the first time I reverse engineered a scenario. I said, show me your book, show me how you grabbed him. And that totally changed self-defense moving forward. And that's been decades now. And we were talking about the eyes and soft gaze and focus and reaction time. What I started to do when I started doing the scenarios and it was just intuition back then, is I said, like, the brain is trying to predict the future. That's why fakes and feints work. That's why, but I was trying to look at it metacognitively as opposed through my own bias from, I used to tell people when I had my first school in the 80s, students would say, what do I do if the guy has a gun? And my answer was, what's in your wallet that's worth your life? Give me and then I realized that I had just been regurgitating something that I had heard my previous instructor say, that I didn't really know what to do if somebody had a gun. And as I continued to research violence, I realized that bad guys only want one of three things. It's a short list. It's only three: property, body, or life. So if the guy says, give me your gun, and your intuition, your instincts, and the wisdom, he's concealing his identity, he's looking around, he's at a distance, you're going, oh shit, you're out at an ATM. It makes sense. He just wants my property. But now he's in your house. He's got duct tape. He's not covering his identity. And now he says, give me your hands or give me your wallet. You're going, oh, fuck, maybe this is going to go to body or life, right? And again, it's instincts and intuition, because if you ask the predator, hey, are you going to kill me if I cooperate? What's he going to say? He's probably going to say no. And that's what most bad guys say, right? If you cooperate with me, I'm not going to hurt you. All of this to say is I was just trusting this intuition to build this. And one of the drills that you just reminded me of, we do a lot of eyes closed, eyes open, diffuse vision drills. We do it singularly and we specifically have a checklist. So you close your eyes, you open your eyes, and your training partner will take a stance. He'll be left side forward. He might have his hand in his pocket. He might have a weapon. He might be, one fist jacked up, one hand pointing. And you open your eyes and close your eyes, and you've got to describe his balance, what you consider closest weapon, closest target, which would be the fastest thing to hit you. Escape route, and you would do it over and over again until you cataloged. Again, you're training your brain. So I don't want to, if I run to a drawer where I know like I'm supposed to have a gun for home protection and I open the drawer and it's empty, I'm like, what the fuck? Where the fuck's the gun? Like, you panic. And so my metaphor here was, in a high stress situation and you reach back into your brain to download and deploy some sort of strategy, you don't want that drawer to be empty.
Right.
And so we were, again, intuitively trying to improve perception speed so we would decrease reaction time. I believe that the calm that you were talking about is directly linked to your competence, not your confidence. You can be overconfident, but you can't be overcompetent. And so it was these simple little things. What did you see? What did you feel? What did you think? And then our movement platform, of course, was weaponizing the startle flinch. So it was always primal gross motor, as opposed to the fine motor skill, which I think ties to was the terminology used for the visual, the fine, like when you're really focusing on
the parvocellular system. Yeah. The high acuity system.
Yeah. So that sort of thing, like if you're going to grab the third metacarpal bone, on the hand to drive the pinky back to the elbow so that you can do this fancy takedown, you need to access that vision system and also the part of your brain to control fine motor skills and the specificity. And suddenly that took you out of this more what the police, survival sciences used to call tachypsyche, when things would go slow-mo, and then to limit this auditory and visual exclusion, where suddenly you're that tunnel vision, looking at things through a straw. It's very, very, you can tell I'm out of breath. I'm so excited by this shit.
No, it's very interesting to see ideas converge. And I think just a note, I think one of the great leaps in neuroscience are going to occur through conversations between more traditional, if you will, trained neuroscientists and non-traditional. And I think that I'm excited about where neuroscience is headed. That's just like a little bit like
right.
A real genuine positivity there. So two things about the visual system that I think might be useful for your listeners. First of all, there are a lot of ways to try and adjust arousal state, right? So there are tons of do nots, like don't drink coffee, get a good night's sleep, all this stuff, like don't stay up all night. That's all that stuff about that's kind of baseline stuff.
Right.
But then there are things, so the two most powerful entry points that we've been focused on, or two of the most powerful entry points, are breathing, are respiration and vision. And that's how I got to know Brian and some other folks in the hard to believe there's a breathwork community, but if you will.
Right.
But there's a concept I'd like your listeners to know, which is the notion of open loops versus closed loops. So if I want to adjust my stress level, like say I'm too stressed, like I'm going into something and I'm getting stressed, or something just happened and I know I'm stressed. I can't find the thing I need. Now, we've been talking a lot about physical violence, but let's also maybe just consider situations like an argument. Someone confronts you with something that's challenging for you, a criticism, you think it's totally off base, but in that moment, your autonomic arousal is up, and you also experience a narrowing of options, right? So the ability to stay in that calm state is useful, not just in physical violence, but in negotiations and receiving good critique and things. Lord knows I've been in many of these scenarios. I think we all have.
But it's important. Hold the thought a second. It's important because certainly the law enforcement military guys, as you move towards the danger, or the danger moves towards you, there's again that stimulus response, that gap time. So this is really important to cultivate. This comes back to what I said earlier, is that what Andrew's talking about is, if you understand the systems, you improve your self-awareness. If you improve your self-awareness, you improve your situational awareness. And that's a big thing. So if I understand how things work and I go, shit, my breathing has just changed. Okay, that's the respiration system. Okay, if my breathing changes, my vision's going to change. If my breathing and vision change, I'm not thinking clearly. And so listen very carefully to this, because it doesn't have to be, I'm pulling a guy out of a car, next thing I know his hand's on my gun. It can be, I got a really bad feeling about this car, but I'm a cop and I got to walk up to it. Am I going to go passenger side or driver's side? Well, your fucking heart rate's elevating there. Are you aware of what you need to be doing there with your vision and your breathing? So pick it up from there.
Yeah. So this is what I would call emerging science. So it's not all done and cut and dry, but so there's some general themes. So open loops versus closed loops. So respiration and breathing are is a powerful lever on your level of autonomic arousal. Hence Wim Hof, hence Brian McKenzie, hence all the people who are, XPT breathing. If I do a bunch of oxygen emphasized breathing where I'm inhaling a lot more than I'm exhaling, like, my level of autonomic arousal is going to go up. Okay. If I'm doing a lot of exhaling, I'm going to, my level of autonomic arousal is likely going to go down. Look to those systems for more details on that, because they're really the experts. Now, but breathing is what we call closed loop. So let's say I'm stressed and I'm breathing fast, and you, Tony, say, okay, control your breathing. And I'm trying, but I'm not succeeding. Now what happens is what I call meta stress. People are now stressed that they're stressed, and they're even more stressed because they can't control their breathing, because it's closed loop. My breathing is controlling my emotional state. And my emotional state is controlling my breathing. They're closed loop. They're in this tight dance, and they can't separate. And that direct anatomical link was shown in a beautiful paper in Science, a great journal, 2017, by a different group at Stanford, not mine, Mark Krasnow's group. So vision, on the other hand, not to say it's more powerful, but it's a different lever because it's entirely open loop. So I already told you that if I undergo an inflection in autonomic arousal, something, my stress hits, my pupil dilate, right? Which means makes me better at viewing certain things and not good at seeing, if you will, the whole picture. Slows down my reaction time. But vision, I can deliberately choose to go the other direction. I can dial out my gaze and see the whole picture, bring my level of autonomic arousal down, speed up my reaction time, etc. It's open loop, meaning I can't control my pupil reflexes, but I can control where I direct my gaze. And this is the difference, again, between us and lots of other species on the planet, which is that by controlling your visual gaze, where you place your gaze, either focal or the whole picture or somewhere in between, you can actually control your level of autonomic arousal. So it's a very powerful, and I think an underappreciated lever or entry point. So we're building systems now to try and operationalize this in some more dedicated ways. But right there, there's a tool. Now, one thing that's just, I think, crucial for people to understand is that this panoramic vision associated with slightly lower levels of autonomic arousal or focal vision, the reason they work so well and where they're meaningful for the sorts of things you work on is because they change our perception not just of space, but of time. And so I just described how they can change your perception of space. There's literally a narrowing of your visual field when you're in a heightened state of arousal and you're not in control of it. So your example, the 15-year-old kid grabbed and shoved up against the locker. He was looking everything, of course, it makes sense. He's seeing the bully, he's seeing the guy there, but his time perception is kind of what screwed him up, because he didn't see the left hook that could happen. And that's not a space thing, because the fist probably wasn't raised at that point. That's a time thing. It's the ability to predict and make good predictions about what could happen, not just what's happening, is much better in this panoramic, calmer state. So, and just as a last sort of point, there's a lot of discussion about why we sleep and the function of sleep. And sleep is a very critical feature of all this, because the best way to unglue somebody and their ability to perform in anything, the ring, the street, an academic test, an argument, is to fatigue them, to take away their sleep. In sleep, your perception of space and time is completely fluid. It's like it gets a chance to relax. You could walk, tonight I could go to sleep and I might see you, you might walk in, then my dog might walk in, then my dead grandmother might fly in on a goat. It's all good in a dream, because space and time are fluid. And there's something, we don't quite understand it yet as a field, but there's something about that fluidity of space and time that then allows you to wake up and feel like you can control your space and time through deliberate use of your visual system, deliberate use of your breathing. This is why, I think it was, people steal and kind of bastardize these quotes, but I believe there was Freud that said, anxiety makes children of us all, which I love. And it was either Vince Lombardi or Custa Amato or something that said, fatigue makes cowards of us all.
Yeah, Lombardi.
I think fatigue dismantles this ability to set space-time relationships and work through them in a very dedicated way. So all this isn't to say get a good night's sleep. Everyone probably should be doing that anyway. It's to say that how you use your visual system and how your stress system is engaged is not just changing your perception of what you can see and what's available to you in space. It's changing how time is both registered and manufactured and perceived in the brain. And this, to me, is among the kit of superpower tactical advantages. And I think it's the unconscious genius of a lot of martial arts systems that figured this out. I didn't figure this out, right? The animal kingdom and martial artists figured this out long before neuroscientists like me started getting interested in and trying to pull apart the mechanisms. I'm just giving names to things that I think many of your listeners will say, I hope, in addition to saying, well, he's wrong about that and wrong about that, which is fine. In my business, it's okay to be wrong for the right reasons. In your business, I realize there are very few cases where you can be badly wrong and it work out okay. So I take the seriousness of that is as a very real thing. But I think that the notion of panoramic vision, of seeing the whole picture, seeing yourself in the fight, not just being in the fight, is an absolutely crucial distinction. So I guess I'm here to place a vote for the visual system as yet another, in addition to respiration and some other ones, key tool or lever or entry point to the stress system. And I'll just catch one gulp of breath and then just say one more thing, which is some of your listeners may be familiar with the reticular activating system, which is the system of waking up the brain. And if you look at the neuroanatomy of the reticular activating system, I was just teaching this to Stanford medical students a week ago. It's very interesting. The cranial nerves of the brainstem are part of the reticular formation, so-called reticular activating. This is the wake-up system of your brain. And if it goes too high, it's the stress system. But it's the wake-up system that engages attention. Most people don't appreciate that two of the main cranial nerves that feed the reticular activating system are the optic and the auditory nerve. So we think about the brainstem as like this stuff way back in the back, but the two, well, they're actually optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, and the eighth cranial nerve, the vestibulo-ocular nerve. Those are ancient pathways for waking up the brain. And the ways in which those pathways are engaged, I'm telling you about one, I'm talking about the visual system, powerfully influence your autonomic system, which then influences those 5 things we talked about earlier.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me because it's funny we only talked about this at the end of the show, but the RAS, reticular activating system. And correct me if I'm wrong from a neuroscience perspective, I tell people, like, when you do replication training, you're not sparring, you're actually, this is the attack, we're going to do this. This is a gun grab, this is a tackle, this is somebody trying to stab you, this is whatever it is. The mental blueprints that you're creating in your brain so that your brain can help predict the future, which is improving your perception speed and decreasing your reaction time, what you're actually doing is educating parts of it so that your RAS can pick up things sooner. And you know, this is just my hypothesis, and I have no education, it's just my intuition. And the example that I give to people is like the day you decide to buy a certain car, you've gone, okay, I saved up money, this is my budget, this is my car. That day you're driving around, you notice them on every other block, you know, or I'm going to move, I got to find an apartment for rent. And then you're driving around. The day you told your brain signs that say for rent are now important to me, you start noticing, well, that sign was there yesterday, but you didn't see it yesterday because it wasn't important. So for me, as a personal defense researcher, if you will, is I would tell people, like, if we can train the brain in training to notice what's important, and I look at it as you know, most training modalities operate on this very stimulus response modality where it's like, hey, when you do this, I'll do that, and even though there's, you know, I like to talk about evidence-based training. I know there's if you look at dashboard video, helmet cam, body cam, CCTV, smartphone coverage of real fights, you don't see the moves that people practice. Like if you look at the thousands of images of violence, you don't go, oh, look at that side kick. Oh, look at that uppercut. Oh, look at that. It's really just people beating the shit out of each other and scrambling for positions that'll impact survival. And so I like that. In the same way you had this fascination of how stress impacted people back in 1980, when my students said that, I had this fascination with, like, why don't we see when people are doing scenarios or real fights, why aren't we seeing all the arts and systems and counters that we practice? And you know, I'm on a crazy tangent here, but it was this intuitively trying to, can you educate the reticular activating system is what I'm asking, I just realized what I was trying to ask you, or am I educating some part of my mind of, hey, be careful of this shit, and then my RAS then goes, look out for that, and then there's this detection moment there where I go, like I always make this joke, if I hit a golf ball into the woods and I'm looking for the ball and I look down and I see a stick that looks like a snake, I will always react like it's a snake. I'll never go, that could be a snake, but I think it's a stick. I'll always go, that's a snake. Oh, fuck, it's a stick. Phew. Right? I always err. My body always errs on the side of survival is what I do.
Definitely. I did a podcast a couple of years ago. I don't know that it's still around or it's not worth digging up, but where I said, there's this idea like that fear is this terrible thing. I mean, you're wired for that stuff for good reasons. That your brain's main job is to keep you safe. And
right.
There's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the circuitry of the brain, and it's set up on it doesn't always play out in terms of the total amount of territory. So people go, oh, the neocortex is so big, we're this thinking species. But if I showed you the speed of neural transmission through these circuits that keep you safe or have you step off attack when you step on it, and I showed you the speed of transmission in your parts of your brain that are involved in thoughtful creativity and empathy, it's a Formula One car compared to a snail. It's not even.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited that you said that, because on a future call or another time, I want to dig into, my notion of converting the flinch, of weaponizing the startle flinch, because I tell people this, the thumbtack here as a metaphor is the sudden attack of a violent predator. And that your cognitive brain is it's so far behind the eight ball there that your intuition, your instincts, all of the survival mechanisms that are part of our DNA bypass cognition. Startle flinch happens, and our job in training, at least mine and my system, is to teach our cognitive brain to catch up to what a reptilian brain or our emotional brain, I don't know if I'm using the right terms here, is going to do without your training. So I've seen it, like the highest trained people, could be a guy in the octagon, some shot, like a late shot or a sucker shot comes in and he flinches, he doesn't do a throw, and so you could be somebody who's in a violent encounter, knows who the bad guy is, and something that's not part of the approved tactics in that environment can trigger a flinch. Absolutely. And I'll send you a link to something I did where there's a video, and I dissected, of Muhammad Ali in the, I think, 70s or 80s. Some coked out comedian is interviewing him, and the guy's wearing like this, all white, like flowing, goofy outfit, and you could tell the guy's high as a kite, and he's talking to Ali, and he's got Ali leaning into the story, and then the guy goes wham, and he throws a jab at Ali, like right at the end of the story, and Ali, inarguably like one of the greatest boxers ever, I got this picture of him going startle flinch, leaning back, hands up, fingers splayed, pushing away danger, and I show it in our courses. I go, the guy didn't even hit him. It was like a coked out comedian throws a jab that, in terms of proximity sense and experience, Ali should have known wasn't going to hit him. But because he was completely in a different frame of mind, totally surprised, his amygdala, limbic system, reptilian brain, all of that shit went look out, startle flinch, and then immediately he's able to catch up and recover state and start laughing. Anyways, we talk about this shit for hours, but it's fascinating to me because that's my whole thing, is what unites us is physiology, physics, and psychology. Not like that's the most important thing when it comes to survivability is understanding those systems and understanding the science of those systems, which is why I like to, tell people like what we're doing is behaviorally based on science. And the more we understand it, the better we can control it, the better training we can create. I think that's an outcome from here, like a talk like this and listening to you for the last hour and a half. Like I can't wait to get on a call with my training team and go, guys, listen to this shit. So,
well, it's been very gratifying for me to learn more about what you do, and I think that one of the great, maybe we'll do a part 2 at some point, and we circle back on some of the on some of the practical implementations of this stuff, because I sort of hinted at a few of them today, but I think that, visual system as an entry point, operationalizing those protocols, that's something I'm very actively involved in. Defining some of the mechanism and relationship between the stress systems and these other systems. I think as we do that, in the scientific community, and if we continue, which I certainly intend to, continue the dialogue with people in the martial arts community, in the personal and self-protection community, and first responder and so forth, I think we're really going to move all the needles forward and gain a much deeper understanding. I think that, these days my life is quite peaceful, and hard work is of a very different kind, but I really do want the work to be of practical implications, and also for dumping stress and, moving people past anxiety and stressful traumatic scenarios. That's extremely important. That's a good portion of what we do. Incidentally, if people want to learn a little bit more about what we do have a lab website. This is totally non-commercial plug because I'm an academic. This is not a,
right.
And if you're a tax-paying U.S. citizen, then you're paying for our research. So thank you through the National Institutes of Health. So we have an Instagram where I kind of do some public education, which is Huberman Lab, H-U-B as in Bulldog, E-R-M-A-N-L-A-B, Huberman Lab. And I've been doing some posts there on just different aspects of neuroscience, including stuff like this. We have the same name.com, hubermanlab.com. We'll take you to our lab website. And I really appreciate the chance to share some of the ideas and things. I have watched your career and been learning more about what you've been doing. I should probably come out and take one of your courses. I'd love to learn some of this stuff.
Well, I'll tell you what I'd like to do is come up and put on a private thing for you and some of your students and colleagues, because I would love to have some super smart people, experience it and go, holy shit, or you suck, or, this is almost like flashing back 20 odd years with this guy, Anthony Bleetman in the UK going, okay, but just so you understand that map that you've been talking about, and then there's some stuff like terms like neurotransmitters, myelinization didn't exist in the 80s. Like to me, the
field of neuroscience is still finding its feet. It's
right
in its infancy. I mean, I think it's fair to say we're learning a lot about the brain as a field, the parts list and how some of those parts work together. But we are still trying to come up with conceptual frameworks for understanding how to think about the brain. I guess I didn't deliver on one promise I made at the beginning. So I don't know if we have 2 minutes. I can, not to backtrack, but I mentioned Carol's growth mindset. And,
right.
So growth mindset was something that she discovered where she was studying learning in kids. And there was this subset of kids, about 8%, I think, that would get this thrill and really loved hard math problem sets, even if they knew they couldn't get the answers right. And those kids far outperformed all the other kids on real math problems that they could get right. And so growth mindset is multi-part, and I'm not going to get all this exactly right, but it involves a decision that you could actually be better than you are. It's not a feeling, it's a thought that you actually could get better, even if you don't feel like you can. And then it's the actual, those kids had, and one can build up the sort of positive reward, dopamine reward from friction, being on the incline, think last reps, think high lactic acid, think sucking for air, think hard math problem, think hard conversation with your spouse, think this is the most painful, miserable thing. And the thought, it's a thought that this is exactly where I'm supposed to be because this is me getting better. And it's amazing that these kids had it kind of innately. And it allows them to outperform people, to perform exceedingly well because it wasn't competitive. And I think it's something that Carol and I are now talking about, how to identify a so-called growth mindset circuit to understand how stress interfaces with that circuit and how to build it up through the known principles of neuroplasticity. Maybe something for a future podcast.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that is having taught thousands and thousands of people, I can share the same information. Hey, this is indignation. These are proof of principle drills. This is primal protective tactical. This is genetically wired. You already have this. And I've had people in the class, like, who you can see it, they have the growth mindset. They're taking notes, they're looking up, you can see in their body language. And then there's people who don't. Like, I had one guy, after explaining some really cool experiment where everyone like just got it through a visualization exercise. He goes, this is really fascinating. I'm really digging the class, but I'm thinking now that if this really happened to me in real life, Tony, I think I would just freeze. I think I would just, and I looked at him, I said, you're arguing to be right about failing. And he kind of like looked at me, and like fully grown adult who was like fully engaged, did the exercise, got the dopamine hit. Like there was 2 steps to this where it was like, I set it up in a way that I knew they were going to win, but they didn't know they were going to win until they won. So everyone was like, fuck yeah. And then this guy stops and goes, this is just a drill. In real life, I think I would fail. And I'm going, dude, you're arguing to be right about you dying. Like, why would...
It's early days, and we're yet to do the key experiments. But the way that we've been talking about this, Carol and I, is that that's the when people err towards the lower, there is a mental and cognitive equivalent to the freeze and hide, and these are going to be very primitive and basic circuits that are either going to have you stay put, move forward, or run. And in the cognitive sense, so like a challenge, like I've always wanted to learn an instrument, and I've been just dreadfully unsuccessful at it. But if I just decide, it's very key also to distinguish this, I should just say, between positive thinking. So I'm not the first to say this, but most of the time, positive thinking, you're wrong. So the idea, like if you're 300, 400 pounds obese and you say I'm thin, right? You're not. It might be a useful motivation point, but you're actually wrong. What you're always right about in growth mindset, and I don't say that in any disparaging way. I know that people struggle to break through those sorts of barriers, and it goes way beyond a discipline issue. These are complicated biochemical pathways. But the thing that's really key is that in growth mindset, if you say the friction point is making me better, I'm getting better. Or even if I'm stationary and I'm not moving forward like I'd like to be, I'm still in the fight, so to speak, or in the challenge. It could be a cognitive challenge, a mental challenge. Then in that sense, you're absolutely correct about where you stand at that moment. Whereas saying you won, it's like saying I won when you didn't win. It's like I watched that Chris Algieri-Pacquiao fight, and his trainer comes to the corner. He's like, you're doing great. And he was getting clobbered, right? It's like, that's misinterpreting.
Right.
Yeah, that's not helping. It's not being delusional about where you're at. It's being actually hyper realistic about where you're at and understanding that however painful that point is, it's going to get you where you want to go.
It's fascinating because we have a component of our course where we talk about performance psychology, and I never use the term peak performance for some of the subtle nuances in what you just said about being hyper realistic, where I'd say you can never peak, because if you literally peak, that means tomorrow you can't peak. And I get what people are saying, but it was just changing the phraseology enough that said, I need to, right now, whatever I have to do, I got to be the best I can be. And I might have the flu, I might be sick, I had a shit night's sleep, I just fought 12 guys and there's a 13th guy, holy shit. And I would tell people that what you need to work on is your capacity, not your potential. That if you think about your potential, then you're always reaching for something that you can't do, where capacity you build on. It's your bedrock. And it was just like, again, it's a reframe in connotation, in how we talk. And this is you're talking about in the growth mindset, and that idea of that dopamine and being at the edge where you go, okay, like this is scary. I call it the comfort zone, discomfort zone, holy shit zone. And always trying to make your comfort zone bigger by playing in the holy shit zone, by going, what are the things that scare me? And as long as I can do some sort of scientific experiment that's not going to, injure an animal or a kid or myself, how can I learn that? I expand that proverbial comfort zone. And now I'm getting good at these things. But to do all that requires the right language. That's our inner coach. How are we talking to ourselves? We're not deluding ourselves. We're not bullshitting ourselves. And then there's the research that I'm sure you're way more familiar with than I am. And that's like the myelinization of neurons and neurotransmitters and stuff like that. Like if you're practicing and you're failing all the time, you're maybe not growing. And if you're doing shit that's too easy, you're not growing. You got to find that that sweet spot where it's challenging, but there's always that, it's like working out. You got to add some weight. There's got to be some resistance.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the physical training is a great analog for all this. And I think that, there are times when I'm in deep strain on a hard task, and could be physical, could be cognitive or intellectual, could be emotional task, right? And I think adopting that those feelings of discomfort are your system getting better within reason. I mean, you obviously don't want to place yourself in danger, and you have to put in your a priori knowledge about what's a good situation for you to be in, or not, and not put yourself at risk unnecessarily. But when you're, especially with intellectual challenges or learning new skills, there is no path to acquire new skills well and have them reach the point of automaticity where they're reflexive without experiencing the feeling that you really are quite poor at them first. And I don't know when we sort of got it in mind that wasn't the case. And, a little anger, a little grit, and a little determination is helpful, but that's only part of the story, right? Because those are the first things to go when conditions get bad, right? And I think that, anyway, that's kind of maybe just kind of a peek around the corner of where things are headed. Carol and I are formalizing some of this into experiments, both in animals and humans. And we're really excited about, like answering the questions. Hopefully, in a year or so, we'll be able to tell you, okay, here's a circuit in the brain that kind of has the features of growth mindset circuit. Here's how to make it work better. Here's
that's the big thing. That's the big thing is it something that you can manipulate through thought or massage? I'm tongue in cheek there, but like, it'd be neat if we could take somebody who doesn't have the growth mindset and go, hey, do this breathing exercise, do this visual exercise, do this, and your growth mindset is going to start to kick in. That would be
right. Like, so the questions I have these days, so this is, I guess, more of just kind of peek toward or look to the future, is what are the states of being? And that's nothing mystical, but what are the physiological states that lend themselves best for learning? What are the physiological states that lend themselves best for consolidation of learning? What are the physiological states that are best for growth mindset, et cetera, et cetera? Because in the physiology, then you can start to reverse engineer or engineer the entry points. What's the visual tool? And I think we look to the animal kingdom to tell us, for some things where to look. But I, of course, I've revealed my biases, that the visual system is one of the most powerful entry points. And anyway, so that's where things are headed. And lots to do. Maybe we'll do it. Maybe there'll be a project.
Well, maybe we'll have you on every month. I don't care.
Well, I'm delighted that you invited me on this time, and I'd love to continue the conversation. I really appreciate it, and your listeners' time. I know there's so much information out there, and to the extent that this was helpful or useful, I'm grateful to you as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Well, we'll put all your contact information in the show notes and get this out. And Andrew, thank you so much for all the work you're doing, and the fact that you're a badass who became a neuroscientist is the street cred for me. And I'm looking forward to actually not just getting to know you better, but actually running you and some of your crew through some of our training and having like active neuroscientists going, or holy shit, or you're right on the money, like keep this going, or tweak this, or try that. Because my whole thing for, I'm 58 now, since I'm 15 is I just felt like I, for some reason, was going to figure out a way to help make humans safer. And that's been my singular focus for 43 years of teaching now, is how do I make people safer? So
what a great thing. We'll definitely have to have you up to Stanford and take you through some of the lab stuff, and the people in the lab would benefit so much from your expertise. I think a dialogue would be a lot of fun. So thank you so much.
Thanks, man. Okay. We will, this will be continued.
Great. Okay,
man. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.